Welcome everybody to another edition of our Byron Community Podcast, and welcome Jessica Ellis to our show.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
It's a pleasure. Jessica, I think we can't start our podcast without letting people know that you're not long in the seat of being the festival director of the Byron Writers Festival. My first question to you is why did you decide to move from the very cultural city of Adelaide to the north coast of New South Wales?
Yeah. Well, I'm so fortunate to be in this position, curating the Byron Writers Festival. It's, probably the best arts job in the country, I'd say. I had spent the last 5 years in Adelaide as CEO of the State Writers Centre there. And I was really, really proud of everything that I'd accomplished there and, started to get that feeling that maybe a new challenge was on the horizon. And when I saw that the festival was looking for a new artistic director, there was such a pull. I was really drawn to it. And the festival has such an enormous reputation. It really is such an experience. It's different to other writers' festivals. So there was no question about it. And it's been wonderful spending the last couple of months getting to know the place.
Part of the reason the Byron Writers Festival exists is because the Adelaide Writers Festival years and years and years ago, before we started the festival, I took believe it or not, a train down and a bus back and then a train to go to Adelaide, and I shared a cigarette, I remember, behind the tent with Elmore Leonard, who'd just taken up smoking again after 10 years of being off the fags. But I remember walking out onto the green where the festival was held, and they were intense in that February, I think. February, is that right? February, March?
Yeah.
Super hot weather, but in canvas. And I thought, that solves the venue issue. And then we went home and we built an event here over the last 30 years. But Adelaide was in part responsible for the tents we used. Where did you grow up?
I'm from Melbourne originally, and my family are from the western suburbs, around a few different places, but they're in Werribee, so western Melbourne.
Yeah. And you did you study in Melbourne, and then how did you end up in Adelaide?
Yeah, so I studied professional writing and editing at TAFE. That was where I did my first arts education in a TAFE course that, like many other TAFE courses, doesn't exist anymore. So a lot of those diploma degrees, they over successive years of cuts to vocational education, they have just disappeared, which is a tragedy, I think, because that's where I discovered poetry, really, where I discovered professional practicing poets. I was already a reader, and I was already someone who liked to write my own poetry, but it was at TAFE where I discovered that you could be a real life practicing poet. And from there, I went on to study creative writing at RMIT and did honours at RMIT in feminist poetry. That's what I wrote my honours thesis on. And really just wanted to work in the arts. I really just wanted to have my job to be the thing that I was really passionate about as well. And so when I had my first proper job curating a writers' festival, which was at Melbourne Writers Festival, it was everything just really fell into place. And for me, literature and festivals, it's to me, there's nothing frivolous about it. This is, to me, really important work. It's about bringing literature and culture to people, and that there's a really important value there. It's about participation in civic life. It's about the beauty of language and literacy. So it's a thrill to be working in this space and to have been at such great places like Melbourne Writers Festival, like Writers SA, and now Byron Writers Festival.
I think there will be people listening to this who would be inspired to hear your story, because there's no direct, unless I'm wrong, you can't go and do a course that says festival director per se. You can't study that, but you can do a series of things that might help you when a job comes up. and I know having interviewed lots of people for festival directors' jobs or been on panels that have done the same, is that people have different ideas or visions about what a festival director does. So take us through a little bit about what you do in the other jobs you've had in this job, and tell us a little bit about the big picture of organising a festival.
Yeah, it's one of those comments that I get all the time after the festival, which is like, oh, well, you must be, just taking time off now, do you?
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's actually it's a year round. It takes a year to put on a festival just from the curatorial aspect. But right, so, okay, to put on something like Byron Writers Festival, a lot of my job involves reading. So reading a lot of books, everything that comes out in a particular year, everything that comes from publishers, or you go out and search for everything that's being put out all around the world. So what's being published here in Australia and then internationally. And you start to weave bits and pieces together. So, and it's about inviting writers. So you reach out to people and you put together a couple of ideas about what you might want them to do at the festival, and then you put out so many invitations, and you kind of see what comes back and see who you can book and what you can put together and how that starts to fit together. You have to then create all of the individual sessions from all of the writers that you've got. So this year at Byron Writers Festival, we've got over 160 writers. It's one of our biggest programs ever, and they're participating in about 130 individual sessions. So it's this really interesting weave of taking the writers and then finding the sessions for them to peer in together. And it's this wonderful kind of alchemy when you find the combinations of writers and the threads, the commonalities between their works. So some of them might be appearing, just a one-on-one talking about their book, which is really kind of intimate and in-depth. And then you might find a couple of writers whose work intersects in a particular way, either in form, if they're, poets or journalists or whatever, or subject matter, and then find the themes that ties it all together that then also connects to, say, current issues in politics or in society. So it's a really interesting, complex process that I really love, and you've got to know so much about what's out there, about what's interesting and what will be interesting to other people. That's the thing, because I've got my personal passions, but it's also being well read enough and curious enough to think there's an audience for this niche thing or for this particular thing, and also trying to predict what will be of interest to people a year later when the festival is on. And that is just the programming. So then there's the production side of things. There's the site. There's the logistics of fences and box office and tech and sound, lights, all of these sorts of things. There's the marketing component. It's and this is why we work all year round to put together the festival.
We both, I know I had this conversation once before, we both love the electricity of live events, and that's why, and I love that word, alchemy is one of my favourite words. It's when Hemingway won his Nobel Prize for Literature, he described the art of writing fiction as a combination of alchemy and some other things, and I agree with you 100%. Programming an event is part alchemy, part focus and all these other things. But one of the things that people often ask me, or they have over the years, about events like a Writers' Festival is how do you work out who to invite, and how do you know if they're going to be any good or not? And one of the things you said to me a minute ago there, you've got 130 different sessions, and the Byron Writers Festival has managed over the years to produce really good sessions, sometimes because of the similarities of the books and the authors, but sometimes because of the complete differences of the people up on the stage. How do you work out who to put on what panel?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You're trying to find the right combinations of people who fit together, and that might be because they know they have similar backgrounds of areas of research, or they're both interested in a particular subject. But you also don't want them to be too similar. You also need to have a degree of contrast with them as well, and you might want a bit of spark to be there as well. A lot of it is about knowing their work really intimately, and knowing what they're like as a speaker. So with some of the really high profile writers, we kind of know those things because we've seen them around the place a number of times before. And I think this is where it becomes a little trickier for emerging writers, is often if they're an unknown quantity, it's sometimes a little bit of a leap of faith. So sometimes you might read a book from a new author and you'll say there's something magic in this. And then I think sometimes you get a sense of what a person's going to be like on the stage. For some writers, they absolutely delight in the experience of being up on the stage, talking about their craft. For others, it's the worst thing. Their publicist is like pushing them up on the stage, like, you've got to go sell your book. But we find that, most writers coming to Byron, there's something special about it, and they know that they're going to have a great experience at our festival.
They do, and you often see them sitting in the tents. I think there's 5 different venues you've got going simultaneously, 5 or 6 venues you've got.
6 this year.
6 you've got going this year, so they get plenty of choice. But I often look into the tents, or in the A&I Hall now in Bangalow, look into there, and you can tell without hearing what is being said. You can tell from the nods and the laughter and the whole body language of the audiences whether they're interested in it or not. Let me ask you something else. With programming, when you sit down and you're doing the programming, you're trying also to, in some ways, work in advance, in the sense that you're inviting writers pretty well, as you said before, a year in advance. Sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're not, and sometimes it's good judgment in lieu of luck. But I noticed on this year's program, you probably couldn't have programmed a better list of speakers and guests this year, because they're not all writers, they're thinkers, and they're not all fiction writers. So anyone out there who's never been to the festival, I always believed, for what it is worth, Jessica, they should have been called Readers Festival rather than Writers Festival.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think if they had called them that, a lot more people would have found their way earlier to the festivals thinking you didn't need to be a writer. But sometimes there's this thing that happens where you program someone for 8 or 9 months and then bang, whatever their book's about, all of a sudden it's what everybody wants to talk about. So there's a little bit of luck in there, I'm guessing. How do you know, what I'm saying is, how do you know 8, 9, 10 months in advance who to invite?
You get a sense of it, and I guess you also want a mixture of things that are going to be topical, but things that are also kind of evergreen. And if something's just like a hell of a good book, it doesn't matter what's going on in the world. Like that, like a great book is always going to stand up as a great book. Sometimes I think though it's also being attuned to the world around you and to like news, and you start to get a little bit of a sense of, oh, well, I know that so much of this year's festival is around the environment, of course, and at the moment there's so much going on around energy policy. So of course that was just something that came together really beautifully, that by the time that the festival comes out, we know that that's going to still be one of the main things that will be on the news every single day. So I think it's, that's one of the things about being a reader and being a writer, is being attuned to the world around you and being connected to other people and being connected to all of the conversations that are going on, because these books and these works don't exist in a vacuum. They're a product of people who are interested and engaged in other people's lives and in themes and subjects. So I think if you have your ear to the ground and you're paying attention, you can sometimes manage to pick a couple that are going to be winners like that.
I think you've picked more than a couple this year. I think you did a fantastic job this year. You've got so many topics and writers there. It would be easy as a festival director, I'm guessing, to shy away from stuff where you could get bruised or burnt. And there's a lot of writers' festivals in the country, and there has been instances where things said there, not by the directors so much, but certainly by some of the writers, has led to what I can only call hot potatoes and whatever else. When you program, do you go towards that stuff or do you run away from it? You know what I mean, as the director.
I feel like you have to go towards it, because I'll often think about, I might have kind of two things going on in my mind at the moment, which is what are all the books that are coming out? But then on the other side, I'm thinking, what are all the things that are important right now? What are all the big issues? What are the things that people are going to be seeking out? So I think you've got to be aware of the fact that people are seeking the insights of writers to provide, illumination on some of these really difficult topics. And so I think you need to include those within the programming. You'll put together, a couple of people who are variously expertised in subject matter, whether they have lived experience of something, whether they're a researcher or an academic, whether they've spent 2 years writing a novel about something. These people are going to have a lot of nuance and great insight into, really thorny topics. And who better to hear from and to get that dialogue between people? That to me is very generative and important, and it's that wonderful feeling at the end of a session where everyone's kind of walking out of the marquee and you can see that kind of buzz and also that deep thinking that's happened. And that, I think, is one of the really important things about writers' festivals.
You go into the line where they sign their books afterwards, or you go to the coffee queue, and over the years, a session's landed when you hear all these people, some of whom never met each other, in a queue, arguing or discussing or, it's something that they've just seen. What are some, other than the environment, which the program is got a lot of good sessions on the environment issue. Other than that, what are some of the other topics and issues that people get a chance this year to see discussed by those writers?
Yeah, politics is pretty well represented from a few different angles. We've got a really incredible range of journalists who are also just beautiful writers, people who put together really, really stunning narrative nonfiction. People like Nick Bryant, who's written about US politics. We've got John Lyons, whose his book Balcony Over Jerusalem has been reissued. We have this fabulous Indian poet and activist, Meena Kandasamy, who's been reporting on the elections in India for the last couple of months. And the three of them will actually be providing some insight into this year of elections. It's the year where there's been more elections around the world than ever. Over half of the world's population has been voting. So incredible. Media has come out really strongly. We've got Eric Beecher, of course, owned the Echo at one point, and is the owner of Crikey still, and was famously sued by Murdoch and by A. Murdoch and won.
Yeah.
So he's got a new book out about the media, and we've got another book from Walter Marsh about Rupert Murdoch's origins as a young progressive. So politics, media, and there's a lot of really fantastic literary fiction. You mentioned Richard Flanagan, and we have the memoir from Richard, but we have two Miles Franklin long-listed writers. So they're in the running right now. One of them might win by the time the festival comes around. Charlotte Wood with Stonyard Devotional.
It's a fantastic book, that book.
I think one of her best.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And Melissa Lukashenko, of course, with Eden Glassy.
Always wonderful, whether she's got a new book or not, because she gives us all She doesn't varnish her words. I see her up on a stage. She's amazing to listen to.
Absolutely. And one of the sessions that I think there's so many great combinations of people in this program, and one of them that I'm particularly excited about is Keelan Hughes, the Irish novelist, and she will be interviewing Nam Lee about his new book of poetry that we've waited 16 years for. Since his last book, The Boat, which just changed.
I interviewed him 16 years ago when that book came out. Was it that many years? You've just reminded me. Was that 16 years ago?
16 years ago.
I did it. I interviewed him and Kate, the short story writer. I remember her surname in a minute. Excuse me, I'm embarrassed, but I interviewed him in what was supposed to be a little tent, and it ended up being a jam-packed. He's an amazing guy to listen to when he talks about writing and his life and so on. So Nam Lee, who else is there?
Oh, we have a two-time Booker Prize shortlisted author, Chigozie Obioma.
Wow.
New novel just released actually called The Road to the Country. Chigozie's a Nigerian writer, and he's written this new book set during the Nigerian Civil War between 1967 and 1970. One of the things that I love in books, and I have a poetry background, is sentences. Like, I love a really good sentence when someone just does something really quite magical with words that just is so evocative, is so insightful, and just, kind of changes the way that you thought literature and language could work. And Chigozie's one of those writers. So is Keelan. There's so many writers that I think in this program just provide that illumination, that really just do something that manages to cast the light a little bit differently. And so you see things slightly changed.
I saw John Banville interviewed in Paris many years ago, and there was about 10 people only in the room. And I don't know why they got onto the topic about inventions. And it was out of nowhere, he was asked this question about the greatest of inventions. They were talking about something unrelated to literature, and he turned around to the audience. I'll never forget him saying his answer to what was the greatest invention of all time. He said it was the sentence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And that, as only an Irish writer could say. Chigozie wrote a book with the title Yellow, one of his novels years ago. He's been around a little while. He's like a mid-career writer from Nigeria.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he's a very, very good writer. Let me ask you some personal questions. How did you find, you mentioned earlier you did a TAFE course that transitioned you from TAFE to university. How did you find your way to books and reading? What was your journey?
My mum was a big reader growing up, and she was really interested in science fiction and fantasy, and loved like Terry Pratchett and Ursula K. Le Guin and all of those kinds of writers. So I grew up in a house that had a lot of books around. Even though it was not a particularly maybe not literary in that sense, where, maybe not a family that went to writers' festivals together, for example, but there was that love of reading and of conversation, I think. We're the kind of family that would sit down to dinner together every evening and just chat about the world. And I think that is one of the first things that's there. And then one of the key moments for me as a young person was going to the St Kilda Festival when I was like 16 or something, which is a great multi-arts, like mostly a music festival, but they have art and poetry and exhibitions and all that kind of stuff going on. And a friend of mine, we just stumbled into a beer garden that happened to have a poetry reading going on, and we were just like, this is fantastic. And we were, of course, interested in like the beats at the time. So we'd discovered Ginsberg and Kerouac and all of these sorts of writers. And so to have that experience where we were like, okay, great. This is these are our people, and we know that we can do this sort of stuff. After high school, I had a slight detour for a couple of months where I went straight into fashion design as my first thing, which I really enjoyed, but also realised that it just wasn't it. Like, this poetry thing kept kind of presenting itself to me. And so I ended up leaving the fashion design course, which was really prestigious, and it was, was doing it because it was so difficult to get into when I got in. But I think when it's not the right thing for you. And so I discovered this TAFE course, and I've really got to say, I think I had the best of both worlds, because I did the vocational experience at TAFE and then went and did the kind of critical theory stuff at uni, and doing both of those things is, I think, the best way.
Why don't you don't mind me saying you're young, but you've had this, you've been involved in literature and festivals and writing now for a long period of time, which has given you all of these insight and experiences. Let me ask you a question about poetry, and I'll tap it onto short stories. As our attention spans has got less and less in the last decade in particular, with social media and the digital world and so on, I've always been amazed that short stories and poetry hasn't become so much more popular that it still is, because you can do it. You can read a poem.
It's a shorter form.
A bit like a movie. And what the point is, why hasn't it? Why poetry's? When you talk to fiction writers, they love poetry and they always speak well about it, right? And they admire it, and some of them write it as well. Whether they and they're like you, they love the sentence and the beauty of the sentence and so on. But it doesn't seem, and still to this day, there's a small niche of people who love it and really enjoy it. Why does it not have a bigger audience?
I think it unfortunately comes down to, in a lot of instances, education and the way that poetry is introduced in schools.
Or not
at all. If you're lucky to have it. I mean, at my school, I went to an independent Catholic school, and I reckon we got Shakespeare and we did sonnets, and that was probably it. And I think once you've kind of studied poetry and you understand like all the different kinds of forms, sonnets are incredible. They're so technically difficult, and when one works, it really works. But if that's the only thing that you've been taught about poetry, then you've got no idea about all the kind of radical, transgressive, or experimental stuff that's going on all around it. So it's kind of a narrowed introduction for most people. And then I think that might also engender this perception of poetry being something that you either get or you don't.
Yeah.
Like, I've heard a lot of people say like, oh yeah, I'm sure poetry's great, but like it's just not my thing, which is a bizarre thing to say, because like anyone can enjoy a novel in any kind of genre.
Do you think though that this might sound crazy, but do you think you've got to learn how to read it and how to sit with it? Do you think there's a skill there that we miss teaching to people?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's the sitting with it thing, because even though I, write and have studied poetry, like I often don't know what, like if I read a poem for the first time, I'm not entirely sure what it means, but I know that it's doing, I can see and I can feel that it's doing something. And it is often it's the form that invites you to read it several times and to come back to things. And I think it's getting people comfortable with the fact that there's no one reading, and you can also, that by the very nature of poetry, it has multiple interpretations.
Yeah.
The thing that's often said about poetry is that it's using the fewest words in the best order. And just by having language distilled in that way, each of those words can kind of go off in 1,000 different directions depending on how you want to read it. So I suppose there is something about being comfortable with reading something and knowing it could mean this or it could mean this, but also knowing that you feel something and then following that curiosity.
The first time we do anything, whether we're learning to play chess or we're learning an exercise, it's hard. And I think you said something before that I don't think we get taught, that even people who read a lot of poetry have sometimes got to read it and sit with it and sometimes read it a few times but that's normal, not abnormal.
That's right.
I had the great fortune years and years ago, David Malouf did me a favour in Galway and introduced me to somebody, and I was able to see Seamus Heaney live. Get up, the Nobel Prize winning Irish poet, get up and recite his poetry. Now, I can't remember much of the words, but I remember how it made me feel. There was 700 or 800 people in this huge hall, and people were crying and laughing, and I remember the feeling in the room when you hear great poetry, particularly Heaney's poetry. You've got this interesting perspective on the North Coast because you've relatively recently moved here, and I'm not going to waste an opportunity in a podcast without. So a lot of the times in our Byron Community podcast, we've got people who've lived here for ages. I think it's good for people who've lived here for ages to hear people who've not only moved job but moved life, which you've just done. What are some of your observations since you've moved up here about the place and about the community?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been so wonderful is getting to know the Northern Rivers region, because I previously had visited Byron and it was really just Byron. But I'm living now in Bangalow, the festival's in Bangalow, and what I've been doing over the last couple of months is just kind of getting out and around and getting to know all these different communities, which are all so distinct, of course, from Clunes to Mullum, to Lismore, like around the place. There's an incredible geographical diversity, but like cultural diversity of these communities. Like they're very distinct places, which is really exciting. But one of the things that I've been loving so much is, of course, the landscape. And I think just when thinking about some of my favourite places that I've been discovering while I've been here, some of it's sort of like experiences. It's like when I, drive from Bangalow into Byron and coming over the hill.
St. Helena Hill.
Yeah, and seeing and just having, like the landscape unroll before you and being to see all the way out to the ocean, and just seeing that every day is just stunning. Going from, going up Lismore Road and in the mornings at 6 or 7 a.m. before and after the gym, and just seeing the fog across the fields. Just some of these things like that are what to me is just, it makes every day really special.
The climate's different too. I did that drive for 10 or 15 years from Bangalow into Byron, and you were nearly always peeling your jumper off when you got to the top of St. Helena Hill.
A bit of variation there.
Because the Bangalow's a bit colder and a bit cooler, and then your fires and your Uggies and all that stuff, and you get to the top of St. Helena Hill. And now, in this time of the year, the whales are jumping out of the water, and some days I fly over Byron a lot in aeroplanes, and the last 3 or 4 weeks, you can see out, if you fly into the Gold Coast, the route on Virgin planes at the moment takes you to the Gold Coast, and you can see the whales down there in the water jumping up out of there. One thing that's always interested me with people who choose career paths that are not like being a festival director is not like being an accountant, right? You are judged, rightly or wrongly, on the quality of the event that you program and your ability to bring a team together and deliver something that in your instance is 4 days. There's lots of other things happen during the year that you run, but it's 4 days, right? Most people can't do that. So I take my hat off to you. They can't do it because it's very, very difficult to do that with all of the balls you've got to keep in the air. But what are some of the hardest parts? This is your first event here, but you've run festivals elsewhere. What's some of the hardest parts of doing this?
I guess the thing that makes a festival different to other kinds of arts work and other kinds of jobs might be the fact that you work all year, as you say, for that little festival period. You spend 360 days of the year working towards this one little week, and everything rests on that time. You've got ticket sales, you've got the weather, you've got you've got the economic environment, all of these things. So I think the fact that you have a pretty short period in order to be on sale. The campaign period's only 6 or 7 weeks. So that's probably one of the things, is the fact that there's that pressure there. And it's also the fact that if you think about the way that you're just sort of like the pace and the tenor of the year, like things do just sort of, increase. Like everything kind of as things get closer and closer. But that's also one of the things that's so exciting about it. And I think what I love about that too is that it all goes into putting together something so special, and then there's nothing better than being in that festival period. So even though you've all been working so hard and there's been so much pressure, to then actually be there on site and to have, a moment when you just get to sit into a session and listen for a couple of minutes, you know that it's all worth it.
You got to look after you too, don't you? You, in the sense that you got to have enough juice in the tank to get you through the 4 days. I've seen over the years the drain, particularly in those last few weeks, because what can go wrong does go wrong. You mentioned before there's 160 writers. There's a large portion of those, I'm going to guess 90% of them come from somewhere else. You got to get them here. And there's strange things like the weather and aeroplanes and cars and all of those sorts of things. And I know you've got a great team behind you that help you in that instance. But that logistical campaign alone is very, very difficult, because it can change at the last minute. You can have just about everything happen, can't you? Flights cancelled and all those things. One last thing before we run out of time. I'm always interested in talking to people who do events like this, who manage events, whether it's in music or whether it's in literature and so on, is that do you get an opportunity with events like this, with a literary festival, to not only watch what goes on, and I know you're too busy generally during the time, but to get some feelings from the people who attend about what they think about it? And how do you do that?
Oh, yeah. Well, you just talk to people over the weekend. Yeah. A lot of it's just, maybe just standing in line for a coffee and just saying, how you been finding it? What have you just seen? What did you think? Yeah. And I think there's also, like, kind of is the vibe as well, isn't it? Like, you kind of get that sense in a marquee, or when you're strolling around the ground, or before or after the event. Whether we're running the bar in the A&I Hall this year. I think like the quality of the conversations going around. Yeah. And I think it's the writers too, like, because they, I think one of the other really special things about Byron is that the authors do stick around on site, and they go and
see each other's sessions.
Yeah, that's right. Which is also the wonderful thing, that you'll be sitting and watching a session, and then you look to your left and there's, prize-winning writer next to you. But they stick around, and they see everything too, and you get the sense in the green room, that sense of excitement and optimism. And there's a bit of buzz there. But I think that's one of the hardest things, is when you're working all weekend not being able to see everything. But for me, it's the satisfaction in having the conversations with punters, and also you can kind of track it on socials as well, and see that's actually a really beautiful thing. If I can't get to a session, but I can see, a dozen people kind of like live tweeting it or posting it on their Instagram with quotes from the authors, because people are listening and they're posting like some of the stuff that the writers are saying. And I love that. That's so cool, because then even people who aren't even at the festival, they see it, and they wish they were at the festival then. Yes.
One final question. In your time here so far, have you got a favourite spot, somewhere that you go and hang out, just it's special to you already?
I've got a few places. I mean, one of the things that I like to do is hiking and bushwalking. And at the moment, I mean, it was raining for, most of the first couple of months that I got here. So I'm glad that there's been some.
It did stop though. Finally, a couple of weeks ago.
It did. So as the skies have cleared up, I've been really enjoying getting out and about and walking around. Been around is I think Jerusalem National Park and around Nightcap
Ranges,
ranges. Just spectacular, some incredible places. And then just discovering like really beautiful places to hang out around the place. I'm living in Bangalow, so Common People has become a bit of a favourite. There's so many great places around, and that is really one of the treats, is getting to explore and try everything for the first time.
Jessica Ellis, thank you for being part of our podcast, and good luck with your first Byron Writers Festival.
Thank you so much, Chris.